Hey there, this is Pat Ennis of Ennis Legacy Partners. I'm here with my business partner, Corby McGordon, and business associate, Joe Markovich. Our mission here on the podcast is to provide you, the business owner, with subject matter expertise on topics pertaining to building transferable or sellable business value, and then for helping you plan your eventual exit from the business. We want to help you build a business that's transferable and then help you exit successfully on your own terms and conditions. And today we're especially excited because our topic we've never covered it before. It's a first time topic on the podcast, and we've been doing this for, 4 or 5 years. If you have been listening to us for a while, you've heard us discuss employee stock ownership plans, or ESOPs, their pros, their cons, where they could be a good fit for a selling owner or owners. ESOPs, they've been around for quite a long time in the United States. The first one was created in 1956, I think. A San Francisco lawyer and economist, the way I understand it, created the first one to transfer the ownership of a newspaper company. And then they gained further significance and legal recognition with the passage of ERISA in 1964. So they've been around in the United States for quite some time. That's the point. But we're not going to talk about ESOPs today. We're going to talk about another strategy that is similar, but can have different legal and tax structures. This strategy has been popular in the UK, United Kingdom, for quite some time, but it's fairly new here in the States. But it seems to be gaining some traction as an alternative to ESOPs. And so we want to know more about it. And our topic today is employee ownership trust versus employee stock ownership plans, ESOPs. We want to get to these questions. What is an employee ownership trust, and how does it differ from ESOPs? Why would an owner do one rather than the other? And why haven't we heard more about EOTs in the past? Our guest today is Loren Rodgers. Loren is the executive director of the National Center for Employee Ownership. He's been working in employee ownership since 1995 as a researcher, advisor, public speaker, author, media contact. Loren has worked with many forms of employee ownership and has expertise in plan design, communications, employee involvement, governance, management, and organizational culture. After college, Loren spent 3 years in Czechoslovakia, where he witnessed the privatizing of a centrally planned economy. He became fascinated with the structure of business ownership and was convinced of the potential of employee ownership. And during his summer internship in '94 in Ukraine, he worked with small businesses, privatizing with both NGOs and the International Monetary Fund. His master's degree is in public policy, where he focused all of his coursework on employee ownership. He's an executive fellow at Rutgers University Institute, serves on the board of several organizations in the field and on governing bodies of employee-owned companies. And he's somewhat of a Renaissance kind of guy. He's a world traveler. He's been everywhere. He's a rock climber, a gardener, an occasional beekeeper, and he cooks Southern Indian food. So great to have you with us, Loren. Welcome to the podcast. And your range of interest is impressive, for sure. But
Thank you, Pat.
A rock climber, really?
Yeah. It's good fun. It feels like employee ownership sometimes. Pulling yourself up on little ledges and crags.
Okay, that's a nice transition.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. We have quite a few questions for you today because this is a new topic. It's a new topic for us.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Laura, I'll kick it off with the softball. A lot of us are familiar with ESOPs. They've become very common, at least in conversation. But an EOT, what's the difference between an ESOP and an EOT?
Sure. We can start big picture, which is that some things are really common between them. They're both really good ways for or for some companies, for exit planning. They kind of help preserve legacy, give the owner fair market value for what they've built over the years. So there's a lot of people that are considering employee ownership. They weigh those two as some of their primary alternatives as an approach to exit planning. But that said, there are also some just enormous differences, both in terms of style and the legal framework, and in how all the numbers pencil out. One sort of very general way to think about the differences between employee ownership trusts, EOTs, and ESOPs is that an EOT is really flexible, really, well, I don't want to say cheap. It's a lot less expensive than an ESOP to set it up. But an EOT is a very principle-based structure, so it has a lot of guiding principles behind it, like the idea of allowing the trust perpetually own the company if that's what the owner desires. Whereas by contrast, the ESOP is much more of a rule-based structure as opposed to a principle-based structure.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. And then one of the things that just kind of popped into mind, from the owner's perspective, where an ESOP actually buys the company, and usually a seller's note and a bank note, does the EOT actually buy the company then from the owners?
Sure. What usually happens, and this will be a theme of this conversation about EOTs, is it's almost everything is usually, because you can do a lot of things in a lot of different ways with an EOT. But that's a really good question, Corby, because you're right. An ESOP literally does buy the shares from the selling owner. An EOT, usually the company itself redeems almost all the shares prior to the company becoming EOT owned. And then the remaining, say, 1% of the shares, usually it's a contribution from the seller to the EOT.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the redeeming of the shares, just what does the benefit stream look like for the owner? Because I can imagine that becomes a question for an owner as to how's this work and how's it affect me in my exit path.
Mm-hmm. So with an ESOP, it's pretty well laid out. You could think of there as being kind of a 2x2 matrix for how an ESOP is set up. It can either be a full sale or a partial sale, and it can either be leveraged or not leveraged. And as you mentioned, Corby, often that leverage includes seller finance. 2/3 of ESOPs involve some seller finance. So the stream of income to the owner depends on in which one of the cells of that 2x2 matrix the ESOP transaction fits into, and it also depends on other components of the deal, like if there's any warrants or synthetic equity that are attached to the transaction. With an EOT, it's really flexible. Most companies, they sell their shares to the company and since when they do that sale, they are the owners of the company. It's sort of a negotiating with yourself kind of arrangement. So most companies do create either an outside appraisal or some valuation mechanism, some multiple of EBITDA often that they use to drive the sale.
Yeah. And then in terms of the timing, where an owner may want to recognize some value, tangible value, doing an ESOP, and like you said, banknote, 1/3 of it, maybe, and then they often have a runway where it's still 3, 4, 5 years while they transition to the next generation of ownership. does that timeline look the same in an EOT, or is it more uh, as the owner is kind of approached that point of, okay, the team's ready, they can run it. I'm going to ride off into the sunset, but receive a benefit stream and sit on the beach while I do it.
Yeah, both EOTs and ESOPs are pretty flexible on that front. Either an EOT or an ESOP can, depending on how it's structured, pay all the money up front if they can manage the financing, or if the company happens to have a lot of cash on its books. Either structure can also accommodate a long-term payout through a seller note or whatever else. So either an EOT or an ESOP can potentially accommodate both either an immediate payout or a long-term one.
Given that they're kind of new on the U.S. scene, how do banks view EOTs? I think a lot of banks are familiar with ESOPs and they're kind of comfortable with them.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I'd say I'd amend that slightly to say some banks are comfortable with ESOPs.
Yeah, well,
yeah. If it's anybody who might be looking for one, at our website, NCEO.org, we've got a finance toolkit that has a bunch of banks that have experience with ESOPs. But that's a really good point, Corby. Banks are not familiar with EOTs, and that is something we hear pretty often from EOT companies that come to our EOT gatherings, is that it is tricky to get outside financing. There are a number of, so I'd say what we see companies successfully doing, one is to just work with their existing bank. Then they need to educate their existing banker on what an EOT means. And that's often the best outcome, especially for companies that are working with a local bank or a local credit union. That often seems to be the way EOTs find financing. The other possibility, and I'd say right now, EOTs, although there still aren't that many in the United States, they do have a pretty good head of steam, partly because of how well they're working in the United Kingdom, partly because there has been a lot more interest among both nonprofit organizations and service providers, advisors who work with employee-owned companies, and they want to have another alternative to an ESOP. So they've been learning about EOTs. So I think the professional community is a little bit further along familiarity with EOTs than potential sellers to employees are. And one implication of that is that there are a fair number of nonprofit organizations, and this is not us, we don't do this, but a fair number of nonprofit organizations that have gotten some foundation money, some patient impact capital to support the development of EOTs. And they do sometimes have some patient capital that they can invest in a transition to an EOT.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, so it sounds. I'll ask you two questions. What motivates an owner? What are the motivations of an owner to do an EOT versus an ESOP, kind of in view of the employees? And then how do they differ in terms of the employee benefit, what the employee actually receives from the ownership?
Sure. So on the first question, what the differing motivation for potential sellers, sometimes it is dollars and cents. The ESOP has some pretty hefty tax incentives that an EOT simply can't touch. And I know you've covered ESOPs in the past, so I don't think this is the time to go into great depth on that. But the owners can defer their capital gains if they set up an ESOP meeting some certain criteria. The company post ESOP can operate without paying federal corporate income tax. And depending on how the transaction is structured, that can lead to a pretty healthy improvement in company performance, which the owner can potentially share in depending on how the transaction is structured. So One difference is often the transaction itself. On that front, the advantage of the EOT is that it does tend to be less expensive to set up an EOT. So for some companies, an ESOP is simply not feasible. If you have 15 employees, if you have 4 employees, you're just not going to do an ESOP. But an EOT can make sense with far fewer employees, and it can fit well there. So that's one dimension, the financial. Another dimension, I think, is preserving legacy, and that's fairly common for both. ESOPs do a good job of keeping companies independent. ESOP companies tend to survive as themselves at much higher rates than non-ESOP companies. But EOTs are even better on that front because they're designed to keep the company from being sold unless the company makes an affirmative decision to be sold. A third dimension is the fate of the workforce. And obviously that's closely related to legacy, but both EOTs and ESOPs do a good job of protecting the existing workforce. For the EOTs, that's largely a function of them being set up to be owned by a trust, and one of the purposes of the trusts is to protect the interest of the employees. In the case of ESOPs, the workforce tends to be better off because ESOPs tend to perform better. That's partly a result of kind of the special sauce of being employee owned and everybody pulling together. And ESOP companies tend to do a really good job, just like EOT companies do, of educating employees about how the business works and what they can do to make it better. They do a good job of engaging people in decision making as appropriate to supercharge the success of the business. But in the case of ESOPs in particular, there's also a built-in mechanism, which is employees are simply more expensive when you have an ESOP. You're giving them a larger benefit stream. They don't tend to quit, so you tend to have better tenure rates. So each individual employee is both worth more to the company and more expensive to the company because people stay. ESOP companies tend to invest more in their employees. They're more likely to have tuition reimbursement. They're more likely to have paid family leave and things like that. So I think that's one reason that ESOP companies tend to outperform. They have a stronger, more durable workforce.
And so from the employee in an EOT, you mentioned that a smaller company can do an EOT where they might not be able to do an ESOP, but also is there a difference between ESOP really being a qualified retirement plan versus an EOT?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question, Corby. So the ESOP is a retirement benefit. As Pat mentioned, it's covered by ERISA, 1974, though, by the way. And so the benefit to the employees of being in an ESOP is intended to be a retirement benefit. They can get their hands on it a bit earlier if they retire early, if they quit, if they become disabled, or if they die, their estate can. But it's intended to be a retirement plan, so there are often penalties for early withdrawal if they do that. ESOP companies do tend to pay more, partly because of the tenure issue, but also the level of benefit. So employees don't just benefit through the retirement account in ESOPs. So, for example, we found that we looked at some Bureau of Labor Statistics data and found that the average ESOP participant has about 33% greater net income than non-employee owners. They've got about 92% greater net household wealth, by the way, so it's pretty compelling. And unfortunately, EOTs are still new enough that we just don't have comparable data for EOTs. But EOTs are designed to benefit employees through profit sharing. So EOTs benefit employees through a stream which might be annual, might be more often, but it's intended to be a medium-term cash incentive rather than the long-term incentive that an ESOP is by law.
Yeah. Hey, Loren. Can you talk a little bit more about that, the profit sharing piece, and what it actually looks like, how it would actually be structured?
Sure. But it's the same answer. It's any way the seller wants. With an ESOP, there are lots of rules about equitable treatment and fairness testing that you need to do to comply with ERISA. But with EOTs, it can be anything. You can set up egalitarian profit sharing, one person, one unit. You can set it up by proportional to compensation. You can set it up by job title. You can have it be. You can even have it be discretionary. Although I don't think I've ever seen a company do that. But very flexible, and it can even be a few of our member EOT companies. They make a profit sharing contribution, but they insist that part of the profit share goes into the 401k. So there's a lot of flexibility on the EOT side.
Yeah. Does the business structure impact EOTs at all, like C Corp versus S Corp versus LLC?
With an EOT, let's see. Not much, anyway. I'm sure one of the attorneys who works with EOTs would have some differences, but in terms of how our member companies talk about it, I don't think there's much of a C Corp, S Corp, LLC distinction.
Yeah. Hey, Joe, do you have any questions that haven't been asked, Joe?
I think so. One of the questions I have, Loren, I come from Canada, where actually EOTs have been recently become part of the option there. And one of the things I was wondering about, is there some kind of a feasibility? How do you assess whether a company is a good fit for an EOT?
Sure. There's nothing as structured as an ESOP feasibility study, but there are a number of providers in the field, and they all have their own approach to EOT feasibility. I know the Canadian EOTs are sort of a interesting hybrid of a UK style EOT and a US ESOP. I know it's a little tricky, and I know the feasibility studies up there get more involved than they would for a US EOT. And I'm sure you know more about that than I do, Joe.
I actually don't know that much about it, but I was interested to know whether there is a way where a company can say, well, we're a good fit for that or not. So it's really, is it the size of the company? What determines the ideal candidate for an EOT?
Well, I think what determines whether a company is a good candidate for an EOT is first the seller's values going into the transaction. If they're really looking to protect the workforce, protect the character, or even protect another set of values like the community health of the community or the environment or something, that can be a driver. Another thing that makes a company a good fit for an ESOP, it's not size. We do have a 2-employee EOT member company out there. They're hoping to grow, but the size is fine. And EOTs can be large. We also have EOTs medium-sized, that could have several hundred employees. And in the UK, the flagship EOT company has tens of thousands. So I'd say one thing that makes a company and a workforce a good fit for an EOT is if profit sharing makes sense. For some companies, you just don't want people to be thinking about this year's performance because you're focused longer term, or the workforce is in a position where profit sharing doesn't make sense to them, and either they need the cash in each paycheck, or on the flip side, they may need a longer term incentive, so they really are building for 5 years into the future. So I'd say those are the main things that would make a company a good fit for an EOT. Maybe the third thing, I'm rambling on, is whether the company is a good fit for an ownership culture, whether the employees are primed to have the energy to dig into the financials, to understand how they individually relate to the success of the business, whether the company has an appetite for engaging employees and informing them to try to really build a culture where everybody thinks and acts like owners.
So one just kind of a two-part question. One is, does the company have to sell 100% of the shares to the trustee or to the EOT, or and secondly, what happens if an employee leaves the company? Do they able to get any benefit from that, or do they lose that?
Sure. So to your second question first, if an employee leaves an EOT, it's just like an employee leaving any other business, unless the seller has built in a provision otherwise. And as far as I know, they don't generally do that. To the question of 100%, both EOTs and ESOPs can own just a portion of the shares. And it's actually a fairly common strategy for the seller to sell a minority stake in the business to either an EOT or more commonly to an ESOP to see how that works for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and then sell the remainder later. And increasingly, we see companies sticking at partial employee ownership as their stable state endgame.
That is interesting, because I think in Canada that they have to sell a majority of, they have to sell 51%. They have to relinquish control, which is one of the concerns there. That's not necessary here, is that correct?
It's correct, but I'm going to say this first part without any data behind me, but EOTs are almost always 100% owned by their EOT. I can think of 2 exceptions. And on the ESOP side, we do have some data, and they're the most common percent of shares owned by the ESOP is 100% by quite a bit. The tax works out quite a bit better if you're an S corporation, where 100% of the shares are ESOP owned. I should mention there's at least one company that has, to what you said, Joe, made me think of this, that has a partial ESOP and a partial EOT. And some of their other shares are owned, they're a publishing company, and some of their other shares are owned by some of their authors, some of their distributors. So they've got a really thoughtful ownership structure.
Okay, so those owners are not W-2 employees. Is that right?
Yeah.
So there's that flexibility that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And when you talk to a lot of the advisors in the field of EOTs, they won't call them EOTs necessarily. Some of them call them perpetual purpose trusts. And that purpose can be for any aim. Patagonia, for example, is a purpose-owned company which works just like an EOT, except the trust is aimed to benefit the environment instead of employee owners.
If we run into an owner then that he's run the company, he's been at it a long time, company's worth say $3 million, and their cash flow is $1 million, they're really profitable, and he wants to set up an EOT and really kind of start his exit in relatively short order. The math behind that then, is a seller note actually taken for a value? It doesn't have to be the full value of the company, but is a seller note actually taken then that the EOT actually allocates some of profit toward paying off the note, the remainder of the profit toward share, profit share to employees, sort of like an ESOP?
Yeah. In that way, they are similar. with the same provision that the EOT is flexible. The owner can set up, and we've talked to some owners who think that they need to pay a profit share in year one to get things off on a good fit, even if there isn't any profit that year. So they may just make sure that the EOT starts off on a good foot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then along that lines, I'm assuming there's a trustee that is not the owner.
With an EOT, again, flexible. We do have a number of businesses where the trustee is the owner. That may be a transitional strategy. We have a number of other companies the owner wants to have nothing to do with being the trustee. And a number of EOTs often have more than one kind of governance entity, the trust itself, and then something called the trust enforcer, or it's got other names, but that's sort of the backstop. It's like the watcher over the trustee to ensure that the trustee is fulfilling the wishes of the trust, of the seller.
So, hey, Loren, we get involved, of course, with management buyouts and sale or transfer to the family, to the kids. Is the EOT a strategy that can help facilitate a management buyout?
That's okay. That's a good question, Pat. I'd say, I don't know if you would call it a management buyout, because the trust would be the owner of the shares, but you could sort of get to the same place. It could be an employee ownership trust, and the business would still continue to operate as an entity. The trust isn't the new management of the business, so the bylaws, the operating procedures of the business, even when it's EOT owned, could still put the control of the business in the hand of a management group. You could also design the EOT to provide a different stream of income to a management or executive group than to the rest of the workforce.
Yeah, and that actually, Pat and I were thinking along the same lines, because the idea of ownership, it sounds like an EOT very similar to an ESOP. In reality, the trust is the owner of the company. The employees share in the benefits of the company. But in terms of the management of the company, it's not all of a sudden a democracy. Instead, there's still a management team that's running it and making decisions, right?
That's right. With a provision that some companies do choose to run themselves and are very participative, even a few in a completely democratic way. But yeah, that's right. In most of our member companies, the way the company manages itself, there's no legal difference in how it manages itself versus another company. But that said, a lot of our member companies think they can get all the advantages of the performance impact of being employee owned by systematically engaging employees in thinking and acting like owners. And that doesn't necessarily mean having everybody involved in board meetings or strategic planning. But in some companies, it does. Some companies do have roundtables of employees to get their input or reaction to questions around the strategic planning. And it really often means some of the practices from the great game of business or open book management around having employees involved in troubleshooting issues that are within their scope of control.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yes. So then another question that obviously comes to mind, an ESOP can run down the road a while, and then if the company's thriving, you can sell it to a third party. And are there any differences with an EOT?
An EOT can sell to a third party. Some EOTs are designed to make that impossible. Some EOTs are designed to make it difficult. and some EOTs are designed to be temporary and completely open to a later sale. So EOTs can be structured to allow a later sale.
And if that were to happen, then what happens to the benefit? Say the company grows over time from 3 million to 6 million in value, and then a strategic comes in and says, "I want to buy you."
Yeah.
Who receives the 6 million?
Yeah, that needs to be a provision in the trust document, but it's not. There's since EOTs are not codified by any law at the federal or state level. They're starting to be mentioned in some state and federal law, especially Colorado. Colorado is kind of leading the charge on this. But since there's not much of a legal requirement for what EOTs do, it's simply a matter of good legal practice in having the trust designed in a way that it covers future situations like the one you described, Corby.
Got it. Yeah, and then it's not a question for now, but it does prompt the thought of, then there's obviously some real complicated tax work there to say, okay, what's the basis of value if employees will share in the benefit of a sale, right? Because it could be a significant tax burden on them if the basis is very low.
Yeah, and I think that you need to make sure that employees get cash for the sale and not just a note if there is one going forward.
I'm sorry. I'm interested in the trust. Who sits on the trust, and what rights and obligations do they have?
It is. It's really flexible, and unfortunately, there is no legally mandated standards for that. I know that every advisor who sets them up thinks that I would argue that you need to have a pretty good representation of people with the expertise to fulfill the role as a fiduciary for the trust. But it is flexible.
No requirement to have an employee representative or an owner. Okay. And who generally are the parties to an EOT transaction? Who are the different players that are involved in that?
So there's the trust, the company, and the owner.
That's it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There can be other parties as well. So, for example, that company that has multiple owners, they'll have other people at the negotiating table. Some companies, as I mentioned, have the trust and a trust protector role, but those three are the essential ones.
Mm-hmm.
So, hey, Loren, if an owner, one of our clients or a prospective client says to us, they start talking about ESOPs and they just want to know generally if they're a candidate. Here's some general parameters that we typically give. We'll say you shouldn't have any or much long-term debt. Your revenues need to be consistent and consistently going up. You should have at least 35 W-2s. You should have, we're telling people 2 million in EBITDA at this point, at least 1 million. And we also stress that you really need a strong management team in place. And so there's just a few general parameters like that. Is there a small set of parameters that if someone came to you and said, I'm interested in an EOT, similar set of parameters that you would, like, for instance, would you stress the importance of a management team, the strength of a management team with an EOT?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the parameters I'd recommend for a company considering an EOT is a subset of the parameters, like the ones you just mentioned, Pat, for an ESOP. It matters a bit less the stable profitability for an EOT. With an ESOP, there's likely to be debt, so an off year could be trouble. With an EOT, it's still trouble, but it's recoverable. It would be a year of low or no profit sharing. One way we think about it is when you're having those conversations, or the people listening to this podcast are having those conversations, it might be good to think about there as being kind of a menu of employee ownership options. And EOTs are one item on that menu. They've got the advantage of being flexible, appropriate for smaller businesses. I think it's good to take ESOPs and split them into more than one menu item. One might be a traditional leveraged transaction. And I think what you just described, Pat, are some criteria that would apply to that. It's worth looking at a non-leveraged transaction for an ESOP as well, which could be appropriate for smaller businesses, especially if it's a sort of a phase-in strategy for an ESOP. And there are some other ones we actually haven't talked about, but I'll mention as well just for completeness. One is direct employee ownership, which is a profit sharing plan or stock grants or a synthetic equity in a broad-based way to the employees, which is another way to build an employee-owned company that's different from both EOTs and ESOPs. Then another possibility is the original form of employee ownership in the world, which is a worker cooperative. They've been around for centuries. They've got some great support organizations, and they are a great fit in some cases. But then the last one that I think people don't think about enough is if you're too small to set up your own ESOP, and you're thinking that an ESOP is the right fit for your workforce, people should consider being acquired by a company that already has an ESOP, because they can avoid a lot of the transaction costs. They can get a lot of the benefits to their workforce that they would get by setting up their own ESOP. And it could well pencil out for them as a seller at least as well, maybe even better, since you're avoiding the transaction costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, one last question, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you for going a little longer than what we told you we would. Loren, really appreciate that. But this is the first time we've talked about this, so it makes sense that we would go longer. Owners who go into either an ESOP or an EOT, they're going in expecting success and working toward it. But that doesn't always happen. And we know it can be very tough and difficult and expensive to unwind an ESOP. I would imagine that's not as much the case with an EOT. Is that right, or am I wrong?
Let me give you a three-part answer. First, I was really struck by one stat that you've got on your page, which was 75% of business owners being dissatisfied within 2 years of the exit strategy they chose. We did a study of sellers who had done an ESOP in the last 10 years, and 90% of them were satisfied with it. So that's just ESOPs. It doesn't apply to the other forms of employee ownership. But my gut is that they have similar levels of satisfaction. Second thing I'd recommend is that companies take advantage of the community, both to avoid the problems and to sort of seize the best practices that make employee ownership really, really sing. When it comes to termination, that's a hard process. We've got, unfortunately, issue briefs and books and conference sessions about how to do it with an ESOP. But back to what your original question was, Pat. Yeah, with an EOT, it's generally going to be quite a bit easier, partly because there's not likely to be any ERISA requirements about how you do it. But then also how easy or hard it is in the case of an ESOP really depends on what the governing documents of the employee ownership trust itself are. It still could be a hassle depending on how those are set up.
Okay, good. Loren, as we wrap up, I'm going to ask you in a second if there's anything you want to promote and your contact information if someone wanted to reach out to you. Before you do that, though, can you just describe NCEO a little bit? Because you are a nonprofit, and and that's intriguing. But if you can just share the mission, the vision, whatever else you want to share about it.
Sure. Yeah, the National Center for Employee Ownership, we're a nonprofit, as you said, Pat. We're a 501c3, so not a trade association or anything else. We've been around since 1981. We've got about 3,000 members. The largest member category is companies that are employee owned or some who are thinking about it. We also have a lot of members who are advisors to employee-owned businesses. Our mission is to make employee ownership thrive, and we see that as having two parts. One, trying to make it bigger, trying to get more people to be employee owners in this country, and then trying to make it better, which is trying to avoid some of the pitfalls and giving people the tools, best practices, and peer networking support to try to make it achieve as much of its potential as possible. We're a fully virtual organization. We've got 22 staff headquartered in the cloud, and that's us.
Fantastic. So what do you want to promote today?
Well, I think a few things that might be useful to people if they're interested in looking at the different forms of employee ownership, including a table that side by side compares ESOPs and EOTs. On our website, if you go to NCEO.org and what is employee ownership, you'll see a drop down that'll give you a table to compare the forms of employee ownership. I'd also warmly welcome people to become members if they are employee owned, if they're thinking about becoming employee owned, or if they have clients that might be good fits for employee ownership. You can do that on our website at nceo.org/join. And then we also have a conference coming up in Salt Lake City, April 14 to 17, and it's about 2,000 people. It'll be I'll immodestly say it's the best fire hose experience you can get to get a really good crash course in employee ownership.
Fantastic. And if someone wanted to contact you, Loren?
They can. The easiest way is my email, which is lrodgers@nceo.org.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. This has been terrific. Surely we'll have you back at some point in the future to talk about one of these other issues. Listeners, if you want help in maximizing the value of your business or planning for your eventual exit, please reach out. Contact us at Ennis Legacy Partners through our website, exitreadiness.com. Thank you for listening. We really appreciate it. If you've benefited from today's episode, please consider liking it, sharing it on social media. Until next time on the Exit Readiness Podcast, this is Pat Ennis with Corby McGordon and Joe Markovich signing off.